Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to look at a few of the figures and tables that were presented in the first module's presentation. I'm taking out most of the slides of definitions and notes and largely going to focus on some of the figures and images that I want you guys to remember. So again, a quick reminder, what this chapter really focused on was three things. One, we talked about measuring development, aid programs and development, and then measuring program effectiveness. We're largely going to focus on these two right now and look at some of the data and figures behind it. So in the first section, measuring development. So on the slides, this graph's active. It's from the IMF. Just gives you an idea of what income's GDP per capita looks like. Again, for those that don't remember GDP, gross domestic product, it's a measure of overall production and income in a given country. So when we look at countries 25,000 or more, you see a lot of the Western countries here. You have the US, Canada, obviously. You see a lot of Europe, Australia, Japan, some Asian economies. Largely some of these lower income countries here still reside in sub-Saharan Africa. And so a big bulk of this class is going to actually center around Africa, some of the Indian areas, some of the stuff going on in Central and South America. But again, you can see the map in terms of economic issues. Yes, there's other issues that exist elsewhere, but the problems seem to be concentrated into a few of these regions. So that's largely going to be the focus. Again, to show you some of the examples of high, low, and then middle income countries, here is a list from the UN. You can see high income countries are exactly who you would expect, mostly Europe, oil producing, Western, North American countries. Your middle income countries over here, it's going to be hard to see. Some Latin American countries, Eastern European countries are in there. Low income countries, middle income countries. Here again, you're getting a lot of African countries. Over here in the low to middle income group, you're getting a lot of Asian and African countries as well. So just give you an idea of where countries fall into this income grouping. This is there's a few of these graphs floating around here. This graph is from The Economist, as you guys can see down here. I love these graphs. It gives us an idea of the global income distribution. We'll look at this a lot over time as well. But really basic, what you have on the x-axis is the percent of the global population. So here 100%. And on the y-axis is GDP per person. So a lot of interesting things surface in this graph. One, average income in the world is way down here at about $15,000 per person. You see this term at PPP. The notes talk a little bit about that. That controls for both exchange rate and price differentials in each country. The idea is pretty simple. $100 in the US will purchase a lot more in China than $100. $100 in the US buys more in China than it does in the US. So it controls for those differentials as well. But what you can see here is largely rich countries, US, Norway, Germany, Japan, Canada, and Australia are all in here, are relatively a small portion of the population, about 10% of the global population, whereas the bulk of the world lives below $15,000, right? All the way up to about 70% of the population. So this idea of U.S. living standards, the first thing to capture and what this graph really highlights is it's unique largely to a few countries, U.S. included. Over time, it's amazing to see the growth of China. For the longest time, they were way down here as one of the poorest countries in the world, but they've grown tremendously. We'll obviously talk a bit more about that. But again, shows you a little bit of the global dynamic here. One of the things when we look at income across countries is income the best measure of overall development? And the United Nations came up with the Human Development Index that actually looks at a few things, right? They say there's three things that matter in terms of overall well-being. First thing that matters is, are you healthy, right? And they look at two things. They look at when you're born, what's your life expectancy? Right? And they use that to calculate the life expectancy index. And we'll show you how they do that. They look at education, right? More education typically gives you better lifestyles and a lot of things. They look at both, on average, how many years of schooling do people have and how many years of schooling is expected. And then, of course, income. right? Income affords you a lot of things. So income's also going to play a role in here. And they just weight each of these by a third, a third, right? So this is effectively another measure of development, right? It's a little bit different from income, right? And what you can look at is each of these indexes. So there is one for life, education, and income. And so the one for life is pretty easy in that it's relative. It takes, for a given country, say the United States, it'll take your average life expectancy minus the minimum value, which is 20, relative to the country with the highest life expectancy minus the minimum value. So the idea here is you want this to be 1, right? That means you have the longest life expectancy. The more you deviate from the highest life expectancy, the smaller this value is going to go. So we do that for education and income as well. And give you some examples of the maximum, right? Japan has the highest life expectancy. The US has the highest expected years of actual years of schooling. Australia has the highest expected years of schooling. The highest combined is New Zealand, right? And the richest is UAE. So you can look at this over time, how their categories are each made. So this is the most recent version where you end up with Norway, right? Largely being one of the most developed countries. They have a pretty high life expectancy. Here's education, right? Here's expected years of schooling, and then here's income. US is ranked 4, right? Down here, you get a lot of African countries on the lower part, right? So we can see that a big reason, it's not just income, right? It's income, it's schooling, and it's life expectancy. All three are weighing those countries down. But again, gives you a little bit of a different perspective on development. I already have a video out there, so I'm going to be able to skip through this pretty quickly, looking at how Lorenz curves and the Gini coefficient is calculated, so we can buzz through this, right? I'm going to skip through this since I've already done it, right? And the next question we want to answer is, how do we measure poverty? Okay, so poverty is essentially how many people are in poverty. So there's a few definitions of poverty. There's absolute poverty and relative poverty. So what we're going to look at is just percent, headcount index. What percent of the population, H, right, total headcount, number of people who are below the poverty threshold divided by population, right? So what's the poverty rate, right? Pretty basic. And so there is a few measures of poverty, right? $1 per day, $1.25 per day, $2.50 per day. So usually when we look at data, that benchmark's defined for us. What do they consider someone in poverty, right? Extreme poverty is less than $1 per day. Right? And so to measure the poverty gap, right, so the total poverty gap measures the total amount of income necessary to raise everyone who is below the poverty line up to that standard, up to that line. So what you are really going to do is, right, this is the poverty line, right? So this is everyone. H is the headcount of people in poverty, right? So how much money do we need to give every single person enough to get above or up to the poverty line, right? What would that cost? So it's just the sum, right? Take everyone that's lying below the poverty line and look at, okay, maybe their annual income is $500, right? And suppose our poverty line to get up to it is, we'll do $250 per day, give us a little bit more, about $1,000 a year, right? To get above the poverty line. So if this person, if we have, say we have 5 people, one person has $500, so it's going to be the sum, right? It's going to take the 500, right? The difference for them. Say one person makes $800, so they're $200 below the poverty line, right? Suppose another person makes $900, so they're $100. Suppose another person makes $400, so they're $600. And lastly, suppose another person makes $950. So the total poverty gap for these 5 people would be 500, 7, 8, 1450. And that's all you would do. And so again, what we're looking at is, in terms of the percent of the population, the total poverty gap here, right? So P is the poverty line, right? And essentially we're calculating how many people right? For this person, how much are they below? This person, how much they are below, right? For each person, how much are they below, right? And so you would take the area of this, right? Or the area here is a little bit smaller group, right? So the idea here is, what can we do to get people above, or how do we determine how many people are below the poverty line? So what you can then do is take the average poverty gap, right? So pretty simple is take that total poverty gap and divide it by the total population. Pretty basic there, right? And then average income shortfall, right? So now the total poverty gap is the entire population. The average income shortfall is just the head count of those in poverty, right? So it's on average, if you're poor, how much are you below the poverty line? Right, aid programs and development. This will be a pretty quick section here. So when we look at this in terms of how much aid people get, right, we can see that collectively U.S. largely gives the most aid, right? But when we look at it as a percent of our income, right, as a percent of gross national income, U.S. is way down here. So we do give a lot of aid, mainly because we have a whole bunch of money, but in terms of overall giving and rate relative to our income, we actually don't give nearly as much as some of these other countries like Luxembourg, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands. They all give significantly more amounts of money. So put this in perspective, 0.19% of our income is a very, very small amount of our overall income, whereas in Luxembourg, Sweden, they're given about 1% of their total income. So one of the, I don't want to say fun discussions, but one of the big areas of debate in development is the role of aid. Does aid help or hurt? It's that old analogy, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. It really is that analogy, and what side of that is correct. And so there are two arguments. Jeffrey Sachs, who's paired up with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, runs the Earth Institute out of Columbia University, really argues that these countries need aid to get them started, right? So great, teach them to fish, but it might take them a couple of days to learn. So we got to get them some food in the meanwhile. That's really his argument. So he views that aid is a necessity to get them to grow. Whereas other people, William Esterly is another world scholar in growth, argues just the opposite. Right, he argues that it does more harm than good. Right, they become dependent on aid, and they don't ever develop the resources and infrastructure they need to grow on their own. Well, again, we'll talk more about this throughout the class. Which side's correct is one that we may never come to terms with. But when we look at the data, right, so we're looking at aid and income in sub-Saharan Africa. Two lines here. So aid is these yellow or these white bars, and total GDP per capita for these countries are this red line up here. Go to my highlighter, right? Red line is total GDP per capita. So a couple trends, right? Starting in the 1970s, aid really took off, right? Dipped down here in the 1990s a little bit, but aid really took off, right? Especially here lately. All right, so what we really want to know is what this line would have looked like without aid. Would it have done something like, it's a little bit thicker of a line here, would it have done something like this if there were no aid? Or would it have done something like this if there were no aid? Right? Well, those are really what the two schools are arguing. So when we look at it, right, William Easterly believes that aid has hindered growth, and that he estimates if we didn't see this massive increase in aid, right, all of this increase here, right, GDP per capita in the African countries would have steadily risen. It would have been way up here, right? So it doesn't seem like a lot, right? When you're talking average income of $625 to $750, that's pretty sizable. It's 20% increase. Whereas Jeffrey Sachs argues just the opposite, that if you take the aid away, right, we would be way down here, that they would have lost income, right? Well, I don't know which side I necessarily believe, but I'm not sure they would have done worse off than where they currently were, right? They were here, so I'm not sure aid would have hinder them that much. But you can certainly buy into the argument that without aid, they never would have got the necessities they needed. So a couple debates to think about in terms of the effort of foreign aid. All right, so does aid hurt or help? Is it easterly up here? Or is it Sachs that argues aid has prevented them from being even lower? So a couple things to think about. Again, I'm going to do these videos mostly over slides that are more technical in nature, so hopefully they help.